eighth meeting that we are having for the Mentoring Institute, the Center of Excellence being created both at the state level and at various regional levels. This is the eighth webinar that we are having, basically to try and develop protocols which would be useful both for smaller towns, cities, and for rural India. You're all aware of it. Mr. Laga Agarwal from the Health Ministry is, I think, held up in a meeting. So we'll start. Today, the topic that we're going to discuss is radiology in COVID 19. Another important topic, I think, radiology, or what I would say is a clinical radiological profile, sometimes plays a very important role, both at times in diagnosis when the RT-PCR is negative. The RT-PCR has a sensitivity of around 80%. So you may have a time when the RT-PCR may be negative, but you may have in a pandemic a classical picture, and you may therefore have to take a call on whether to treat based on the clinical radiological picture. Also, sometimes it may help you in assessing the degree of lung involvement. It has to be looked at, like we discussed yesterday, also keeping in mind the clinical picture in mind. It's well documented that even patients who are asymptomatic or have mild disease may have patches on the CT scan, which will resolve on its own without treatment. So, just if you have some degree of involvement in the lung on a CT, does not mean that you should straight away start the patient on steroids or even consider drugs like tocilizumab. You have to look at the whole clinical picture. But to give us a good overview of this, we have our Dr. Ashu Seth Bhalla, who is a professor in Department of Radiology and is specifically working in pulmonary radiology, and she will be talking on radiology in COVID-19. The other panelists are Professor Raju Sharma and Professor Neeraj Nishchal, who was there yesterday also. We'll subsequently take the questions from the panelists and their comments from different mentoring institutes. But without wasting much time, I'll ask Ashu to start her presentation.
Good afternoon, sir, and good afternoon to everybody who is tuned in. Sir, all good in terms of audio-visual? May I begin?
All good, go ahead.
So my talk, thanks, sir. So my talk is titled Radiology of COVID-19, but actually I'm going to be speaking on COVID-19 pneumonia specifically, which means that I'm going to be speaking on the thoracic involvement in COVID-19. As you know, increasingly, as there are reports of multiple systems being involved from neuro to cardiac, and there are more and more imaging features which are emerging, which are multi-system. But the focus of the talk today is COVID-19 pneumonia. As you're aware, the two main tools that we have to image the lung for any pathology are chest radiographs and CT scans. We'll try and go as to exactly when to do them and how to interpret them. We'll also, discuss this in 2-3 clinical scenarios. One is that COVID suspect patients, which means that you don't have a diagnosis of COVID-19 as yet. Those who are proven patients and being managed either at home isolation or in the hospital, and certain specific situations such as emergent surgeries and all, what can the role of radiology be? To begin with the chest radiographs, has been used extensively in 2 settings in COVID-19. One is in the emergency or ER rooms and in our wards, in our ICUs. And when imaging volumes all over the world fell during the pandemic, which means because the non-COVID work also went down, if there was one thing which volumes went on increasing, it was the chest radiograph, to the extent that there were so many orders for portable mobile units that the manufacturers were unable to keep up with the demand, because suddenly the hospitals realized the utility of mobile units. So the obvious advantage of chest radiograph is that it's point of care, unlike CT, it's not like point of care that you can take it to a person's home, but you can take it to the bedside anywhere in the hospital. Besides, it's low cost. It's very easy to sanitize. Like compared to a CT machine, sanitization of a portable radiography unit is much easier. So by now, most centers would have had dedicated radiography units, either portable or fixed, with portable being preferable in the emergency and wards and ICU, which has been the case for us also. So we have used chest radiographs as our main tool in this setting. Now, how do we use it in the ER? So if anybody comes with symptoms of SARI, a severe acute respiratory illness, which means that they have fever, shortness of breath, increase in respiratory rate or hypoxia, or even if a patient doesn't have florid manifestations but is immunocompromised, you obviously want to do some sort of imaging immediately as the patient walks into the ER. And what do you hope that the chest radiograph is going to tell us? We are at the moment on the diagnostic part. So what the chest radiograph can tell us is that this is normal, this is classical for COVID, this is clearly non-COVID, or the fact that it is somewhere in between or indeterminate. So can we really take this call on chest radiograph? Let's take a look. This picture has become the poster boy of COVID-19 pneumonia. You can see a patient in the ER who just walked in. Patient is intubated. You see the peripheral mid and lower zone ground glass opacities, the reverse batwing pattern actually, which in classical teaching used to be associated with eosinophilic pneumonia, is now the pattern which is classical for a COVID-19 pneumonia. So if you get a pattern like this in ER itself, you do not need any further imaging, and you can quickly triage the patient into the respective wing and initiate treatment. Now, is this the only pattern which is typical, or are there many others? So we analyzed our chest radiographs, we studied literature, and we devised these 6 patterns. And then we validated these patterns subsequently also on our emergency radiographs in COVID and non-COVID patients to see if they actually helped us make the differentiation. Pattern 1 is what I already showed you. Pattern 2 is, consolidations and ground glass opacities, which are lower zone dominant. Again, consolidations and ground glass opacities, which are peribronchovascular dominant. Multifocal airspace lesions, multifocal airspace lesions. A peculiar pattern because of round pneumonia that we observed was in the mid and lower zones, which we call the ball pattern. And then this is a patient of COVID-19 pneumonia with ARDS, which of course has a non-specific picture. What you need to notice in all of these are some negative points, which help you say that, okay, it's not non-COVID. There is no pleural effusion. You may have minimal, we have in one patient, but by and large, the pleural effusion is not a dominant factor. Cavitation is not a dominant factor. Mediastinal nodes are not a dominant factor. So there are so many negative findings in combination with this peculiar distribution of ground glass opacities and consolidation will help you make the diagnosis. Of course, your accuracy of the diagnosis completely depends on prevalence of the disease in the community at that time point. Because as I said, in pre-COVID era, this would have meant eosinophilic pneumonia for us, but now it means COVID-19 pneumonia. So how correct you are will depend on how prevalent COVID-19 is at that time point in the community. So these are the various patterns that I mentioned. Now, let me just show you what will not be COVID-19 pneumonia. So even if patient comes with SARI, shows you a say a unifocal consolidation, which shows an area of cavitation, then it's very unlikely that you are dealing with COVID-19. It goes more towards a bacterial pneumonia or even a mycobacterial pneumonia. So several non-COVID patterns, for instance, this is a case where your eye should go to the retrocardiac lesion, which is showing left lower lobe collapse along with right pleural effusion. Sudden onset of shortness of breath, but air leaks everywhere. This is a supine radiograph, but you can make out the subcutaneous emphysema, pneumothorax, pneumomediastinum. Can you get air leaks spontaneously in non-ventilated stable patients in COVID-19 pneumonia? We can. It's rare, but we can. But if you see the rest of the lung, it's not showing you an interstitial pneumonia pattern or a ground glass pattern. So herein the dominant part is the pleural effusions and associated air leaks. Similarly, bilateral lower zone consolidation, like I showed earlier in a COVID pattern, but associated with a pleural effusion. So these are some of the patterns which take you from a diagnosis away from a COVID-19 being the cause of the shortness of breath. This is in terms of diagnosis in the ER. All the concepts that I've explained can be visited to, I'll keep showing you resources which are open access, and you can reinforce all these concepts through these articles. Now we come to what happens to COVID-19 patients who are proven and whom we are managing in the wards or ICUs or at home. As I said, we are using bedside portable radiography extensively. How frequently will we do it in a particular patient will depend upon the respiratory status of the patient. We do not follow a fixed protocol type of imaging that we have to do it every day or every alternate day. It is a clinical call on how frequently we will do it for a particular patient. What about those who are on home isolation and have not developed any acute symptoms? Can there be any reason that should you, like if you're uncomfortable with the high risk patients, should you do a baseline chest radiograph and keep? So you can, particularly at the onset of second week, if your patient is high risk and you are uncomfortable, that you may not be able to monitor the patient well, patient may not be able to, monitor his 6-minute walk test, SpO2, and you want a baseline radiograph, then in high risk patient situation, even in home isolation and absence of acute exacerbations, you can do a chest radiograph. So this is the typical scenario, like in all patients who are admitted for whatever respiratory illness. Serial radiographs which are available to everybody in the ward as printouts and on the PAC stations is available to all radiologists on the PAC stations at a quick glance to be able to review on site, on remote, and to be able to take quick decisions. So this is the actually, power of a chest radiograph, that you cannot compare 8 to 10 CT scans so fast in a glance as you can in a chest radiograph and quickly get an idea of how your patient is doing. And especially if you suspect an air leak or sudden aspiration, a bedside radiograph is invaluable. Now we come to CT scans. You'll find that a lot of indications will remain similar, but the situations where we use it may change. Let me just specifically touch upon it. Again, I'll cover both the aspects. Should you use CT scans for diagnosis? And what about management? Follow-up means post-COVID part I'm not going to dwell on today, but that is another story by itself. What are the types of CT that we do? So typically patient would undergo NCCT or an HRCT because you want to look at the lung parenchyma. But if we have any situation that we are looking for secondary infections and we suspect infections, then a complete evaluation should include a CCT chest. If you suspect an embolism, then we will have to go for a CTPA, pulmonary angiography. Sometimes we also do a CT angiography, which means aortic angiography in patients who present with hemoptysis. So I will just show you examples of each of these and what kind of clinical situations we would use them in. First, we come to diagnosis. So would we use CT primarily for diagnosis of COVID-19 pneumonias? You can use CT scan primarily for diagnosis COVID-19 if your patient is symptomatic, but the RT-PCR has returned negative. So you want a confirmatory test to support your clinical diagnosis, that is it going with a COVID pattern or a non-COVID pattern. So RT-PCR and CT put together, will help you catch almost all cases of COVID-19. So it's not like RT-PCR or CT, it may be RT-PCR and CT to just catch the few negatives which RT-PCR is missing. Then an equivocal chest radiographic pattern, which means your patient may test COVID-19 pneumonia positive, but you're not, sometimes the chest radiograph is not matching. You're not comfortable that despite the chest radiograph being abnormal, it doesn't look like COVID-19 pneumonia. And another situation can be where you have to take a very quick decision, but the molecular diagnostics will take time to come or are not readily available, and you can use CT at that time point also. Do we ever use CT in a patient for diagnosis who is asymptomatic? So what we have used and what is recommended is that suppose we need to go in for a surgery in an emergent situation, like an intracranial bleed, or particularly surgeries such as FAST. Now with so much talk about mucormycosis, and if we need to go in for a FAST, or we have a patient of stroke who may need a surgery, and particularly when we are taking the patient onto the CT table to image the PNS or the head, we will go on to perform a chest CT also to see that whether there is COVID-19 pneumonia or not. So that will save time. And some surgeons, particularly again, it is described mainly for FES, is that may want to check on CT in addition to the RT-PCR negative status, because they are directly going to work in the paranasal sinus, and a high aerosol generating procedure is planned. So these are the only situations where we would use it in asymptomatic patients. Otherwise, we would use it as a complementary modality with RT-PCR and chest radiograph. Now we come to cases who are already proven on molecular diagnostics in home isolation. What are the situations that you need to order a CT scan? So in patients who are mild category by the AIMS guidelines, you may need CT only if it moves to the guideline category which says seek immediate attention if. So all the factors which lead you to seek immediate attention are also situations in which a CT scan can benefit you, which means that patient has difficulty in breathing, has hypoxia, has unexplained high-grade fever beyond 5 days, and just a persistent mild dry cough is not an indication for going for a CT scan. And you would tend to keep a lower threshold and go for an early CT in those patients who have high-risk features. Early means, beyond, before 5 to 6 days, actually, there is no point in doing the chest CT, because even if you find a CT score of 2 or 3, it is not actionable. Only thing we are noticing during this second wave is that some patients, especially in the immunocompromised group, are not very clear regarding the timelines of their infections. So in patients who have obvious reasons, or you're not clear of the timelines that how many days the fever has been there, and when you may go in for a CT scan in this subset of high-risk patients. In hospitalized patients, that means moderate to severe disease, obviously the number of indications expand. Still, as I said, bedside chest radiographs, and in ICUs, complemented by portable focus or ultrasound, remains the focus of the everyday care of the patient. And we will intermittently do a CT scan if required, if we have unexplained deterioration, if we suspect pulmonary embolism, if there is any disparity in the clinical and radiographic findings, if we suspect that there is a pre-existing lung condition which is confusing the picture on chest radiograph and we are not completely able to understand. Infections, differentiation of fever coming again in after 10 days, 12 days, patient became afebrile, fever comes back again. We want to see that is it really a secondary infection, or is it because of inflammatory syndrome? Because before we step up our immune suppression, we may want to rule out a secondary infection. So there can be several reasons that we will go in for CT scan in moderate and severe patients. So obviously their numbers will be more in the hospitalized patients than in OPD cases. Again, 2 free resources which reinforce the same thing and explain them in more detail, which you can access. Now, how to decode the CT scan report, which is handed to you by the radiologist. Now, if you have performed a CT scan for diagnosis, as I showed in chest radiograph, at the end you have to say, is this COVID, not COVID, or can't say. So there are various classification systems. You can use the similar to chest radiograph, typical, atypical, negative, but the system which has caught everybody's attention as is currently being widely used is the CORAD system, or Coronavirus Disease 2019 Reporting and Data System. So what is the CORAD system? It basically, based on the spectrum of CT findings which is seen, will say the likelihood of it being COVID-19 infection. So of which 5 is the highest category, which means that you see typical COVID-19, while 1 is normal or has other abnormalities not attributable to the infection. CORADS 2 is low, and 6 amongst them is the term which is used when the CT is performed in a patient who is already RT-PCR positive, already proven on molecular diagnostics is CORAD 6. So this just gives the likelihood of this being COVID-19 to the treating physician. Now, this is, for instance, a 58-year-old male who underwent a CT scan. This is what we call a scout topogram, which is very similar to a chest radiograph, but does not exactly, translate into a chest radiograph, showing, like I had shown you earlier, peripheral areas of ground glass, not as dramatic as we saw in that patient. And as you can see, that patient was intubated. This one is not. When you see the CT, this is what would fit into CORADS 5 pattern, which means the classical peripheral ground glass with a mid and lower zone predominance. Now, while on that chest radiograph in pre-COVID-19 era, we would have called it eosinophilic pneumonia. On this, we would have had several differentials. One primary differential amongst us, which is becoming very difficult and challenging, is that in smokers with any level of UIP or idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, for us, acute exacerbation IPF looks very similar to this. And I've taken out so many images which I have, from pre-COVID-19 era, which look like this, and of course was not COVID-19, but in current case scenario of the level of the pandemic, this would get labeled as CORAD 5. Now, what would this multifocal consolidation, but not in the very classical distribution, it's multifocal ground glass, some places, some linear opacities, this becomes category 4. Some terms I will just mention because you will, increasingly read them in reports. So just to decode, sometimes you see these areas of ground glass, and on this area of ground glass, you see a fine network, like a fine lace-like opacities. This is what your radiologist may call the crazy paving pattern. And you see this patient has lower zone involvement, but there is a kind of predominance of upper lobe involvement. There are some areas which are very dense and look like consolidation. Now, what is the implication of crazy paving pattern? Now, crazy paving pattern means that this disease is at least, in the mid-second week, because it is a pattern that the ground glass pattern evolves into. So it's the early studies, in 25, 30 patients, which were done in China and in Italy, who did like day 0, 3, 7, 10. They showed stages of the pneumonia. So this is what the subacute stage would be like, a crazy paving. And as this gets worse, it will evolve into a denser consolidation. Even upper lobe involvement is one of the poorer prognostic factors when we have so much of predominant upper lobe involvement. So this is what is called crazy paving. And the other thing is that these linear lesions which are there are not all septal thickening of crazy paving. This is called VE, or vascular enlargement. As you know, that microthrombi, thrombi, and vascular disease has been a very important component of this pneumonia. And this is one of the most important signs which is described in differentiation of COVID-19 pneumonia from other viral pneumonias. For whatever reason, there is a dilatation of the peripheral pulmonary vessels. So apart from large central thrombi, you can get peripheral pulmonary vessel dilatation, and you can get microthrombi in these vessels. And this dilatation has been given numerous names: Coombs sign, Fan sign, target sign, but basically this helps in differentiating COVID-19 pneumonia from other atypical pneumonias. And as I said, that these signs become particularly important in RT-PCR negative patients and in situations where the prevalence in the community is lower at that time point. Another pattern you will hear the radiologists use the word a lot is organizing pneumonia. Organizing pneumonia is another subacute pattern like the crazy paving pattern, typically described, you're used to the COP, or the cryptogenic organizing pneumonia, which was described in association with CTDs. Was means it still occurs in CTDs, but it is a pattern which has been observed in COVID-19 also, which means you can have these rounded areas of consolidation, which show you central clearing, which has been called atoll signs. So, or reverse halo, halo, all these signs have been described in context of COVID-19 pneumonia. And this is another manifestation of organizing pneumonia pattern, which means these subpleural kind of bands which run very parallel to the pleura, but with a little separation and with some dilated bronchi inside. So earlier we were calling these bronchiolactasis and bronchiectasis, but it has been said with whatever data came out on post-COVID sequelae that it is better not to use the term bronchiectasis or bronchiolactasis, because the use of that term implies that the process is irreversible. But in this phase, this dilatation may still be reversible. And once the surrounding ground glass and consolidation settles, the bronchi may return to their original size. Now, what happens when we get unifocal consolidation? Now, this is a 34-year-old proven patient. We did it for persistent fever and mild shortness of breath. We get unifocal consolidation and we get these mass-like areas. Now, at that time point, this is a scan actually from the first wave, and we did label it as COVID-19 pneumonia, and it turned out to be the same and patient resolved. But now with so much emphasis and reports on mucor, and respiratory co-infections that we have seen in these patterns, there is a lot of pressure on the radiologist to take a call whether there is a secondary infection present or not, because as I already told you, you need to step up the immune suppression. You cannot do BAL on all these patients. It's not so readily available, obviously. And so a radiologist has to take one of the vital calls in these atypical patterns is it COVID-19, is it bacteria, or is it mucor? And all the traditional signs have to be used to answer this question on imaging itself. Of course, we take threadbare history, threadbare lab parameters before we take this call. And it's always an MDT call of whether to go for step up immune suppression, go for anti-IL-6 therapies. And we always take a complete clinical and lab profile before we give our judgment on this. So multifocal rounded areas of consolidation. This is a patient of solid organ transplant who came with fever and was RT-PCR positive, but the CT is normal. So just like, RT-PCR is going to miss patients, CT is also going to miss 30% patients and can be false negative. And the other thing can be that the cause of the patient's fever in an immunocompromised host may not be COVID-19 pneumonia. So, both these situations may be present. So here in the RT-PCR is positive, patient is febrile, but CT is normal. So to summarize, as I said, in a diagnostic setting like this, CORADS 2 would be a non-COVID pneumonia pattern. This is more like a tuberculosis sarcoid pattern. This would be a CORADS 5. This would be a CORADS 4. Now we come to complication assessment. In moderate and severe disease, complication assessment may require us to use contrast. And I'm going to show you some examples. Now, this is a child who is 5-year-old. He's a child of AML who has febrile neutropenia and tested COVID pneumonia positive. On serial radiographs, had an upper lobe consolidation, which was not resolving. But again, we had to take a decision. Is the fever not going away because COVID-19, or child is also febrile neutropenic? Is that another infection? So we went in for a contrast enhanced CT because we were looking for bacterial, fungal. And what we found is that while the COVID changes seem to have subsided and only left some atelectatic lesions in the lower lobes, what we were left with was a lung abscess-like picture, a classical lung abscess. So the consolidation which had been present in the child had evolved into a lung abscess, which is a very low density area in the center, thick, dirty looking rind of lung parenchyma all around. So this is how CT helps you make this differentiation. Pulmonary emboli, of course, another complication for which we will do a CTPA. And now the problem is that many patients will undergo an HRCT. And as I told you, a unifocal consolidation, particularly if it's peripheral, can not only be a secondary infection, but can also be an infarct. So fortunately, the incidence is less now in hospitalized patients because everybody is aware and patient is, initiated on appropriate prophylactic doses of anticoagulation upon admission, and we see a lot less of pulmonary emboli. But another sign which radiologists may have forgotten to look for on non-contrast scan, the challenge for us is not to miss the possibility even on a non-contrast scan. And whenever we see a peripheral subpleural consolidation with signs such as cutoff of an artery, central clearing, associated mild pleural effusion, we go in and ask for a CTPA. The other interesting thing what I brought out is the small vessels. So this is actually not an acute patient of ours. This is one of our patients who came in the post-COVID clinic. Between the two phases, we had started a post-COVID clinic in the pulmonology OPD. And this patient had a lot of residual lung abnormalities. We had done a CTPA because patient had unexplained PAH also, which we were not sure whether it is attributable to the COVID-19. And if you see, there is this peripheral pruning and irregularity. In the acute phase, it has been called the vascular tree in bird sign. This peripheral pruning and irregularity is what, is a consequence of the peripheral arteriopathy that this disease causes. So as I told you, that arteriopathy can reflect in the terms of, in the form of vascular enlargement or in the form of thrombosis. So these are situations that we will do a CTPA. There are situations that patient comes with hemoptysis. Do you get hemoptysis in COVID-19 pneumonia? So, it's distinctly unusual. We have had a few patients, but the hemoptysis has been streaky in patients with extensive COVID-19 pneumonia during the rapid progression phase or the second week. This was a patient who was RT-PCR positive. When we saw the chest radiograph, it was a non-COVID pattern. So we did a CT angiography in the hemoptysis protocol and found active tuberculosis. This showing the tree in bud nodules of tuberculosis. We found a pseudoaneurysm and there was no COVID-19 pneumonia. Patient was positive. We shifted the patient to our trauma center facility. And since we have separate DSA and to the COVID-19 facility and then did our embolization in that setup. This is a pulmonary angiogram showing the aneurysm which we close. So every abnormal chest radiograph is not going to translate into COVID-19 pneumonia. Which type of CT to do also is a call which we may take on the chest radiograph and the patient's clinical background. Post-COVID changes, as I told you, fortunately, the fear which came early of the large numbers that we would see of post-COVID in the clinic that we ran, we used to always do 6-minute walk test, MMRC grade, do chest radiograph, PFT of patient. And if any of these were found to be abnormal, then only we were doing CT scans on these patients. And we encountered various patterns of residual COVID changes. It perhaps may not be appropriate to call them fibrosis because some of these may still be reversible, although these were truly beyond about 6 weeks of their discharge. So a lot of this is unfortunately likely to be irreversible. But as I said, that post-COVID sequelae is a topic by itself, which hopefully we will discuss one day when we are past the acute waves. What is a CT severity score is the last aspect that we will touch. The commonest score that is used is the 25-point score. Actually, CT scores, there are many scoring systems that are used, but it is best to stick to one score which everybody understands. And the earliest score which came and is simple to use and is being used most frequently is the 25-point score. Given by Panetol in the beginning of the pandemic, which is completely based on the percentage of the lobar involvement, taking 5 lobes. And in that study, they said more than or equal to 18 was a poor prognostic indicator and reflected severe disease. Subsequently, several investigators used this score and came up with another cutoff of 7, as less than 7 being mild, and then in between being moderate scores. The other scoring system which you will find being used by radiologists in India commonly is the 40-point score. And why this is 40 point is because this is based on the bronchopulmonary segments. So then when you take the lung and divide it into 20 regions, means even like segment apicoposterior is same on the left side, but we take it as separate for the sake of giving this score. So eventually the score, maximum score possible is 40, and 19.5 was the cutoff given as in this article, which that beyond it, it reflected a severe or critical form of the disease. Let's see an example. This is our one RT-PCR proven patient for whom we have done CT scan for persistent fever beyond 1 week, although patient did not have shortness of breath, peripheral areas of consolidation, some of those subpleural band-like opacities I was speaking about. So what would this is what our report would typically read, CORAD 6 with a severity score of 7/25. And another patient, same classical one whom we had seen earlier, this patient on HFNC, SpO2 was 92%, it was day 11, and the score we gave was 15/25. Many times you will see that there is no match between the score and the patient's respiratory status. We have seen score 13, 14 roaming around with no symptom, not only respiratory symptoms, because there are 20 years old, 22 years old who may undergo a CT scan and have scores of 13, 14, but have no symptoms. So why is there a disparity between CT scores and clinical condition in some patients? It's not a question which is easy to answer, but from what I have understood broadly is that there are multiple factors. One most important is the patient factors, patient's tolerance, age, comorbidities. Some patients may not manifest any breathlessness at that score. From a radiologist point of view, CT morphology, that whether it's ground glass dominant, whether it's consolidation dominant or crazy paving dominant, and where exactly are these distributed, may also help us take this decision. It not only severity, because severity is obvious to the treating physician. The question we are asked very often is reversibility, and second is if it's a consolidation. I already brought out, can this be infection? Can this be infarct? So these are the differentiating points that we have to do on a CT morphology. So morphology is also very important, while scores only reflect extent. The other thing is pulmonary vascular disease. You see, you will see patients who have a sudden drop in saturation in the range of say 85 to 92, 93, not low, but have absolutely normal CT scans, or have very low scores which do not explain this. Now, there are two groups of patients that we have observed this in. One is younger patients where we truly have no explanation, and it is assumed that this cause of the drop in saturation is microthrombi. But secondly is, amongst the patient factors in the elderly, the patient may not tolerate a lower score also. We have seen that the respiratory condition does not match with the score many times in the elderly. And as I said, that if the reason of the deterioration may be a vascular disease, when we may take a decision to go in for a CT pulmonary angiography or a perfusion scans. So to just conclude and summarize, does every patient of COVID-19 pneumonia need some form of imaging? The answer is no. Does every patient, even of moderate or severe disease, need fixed time interval CT scans? 0, 3, 7, 10, 14? No, none of this is protocol based. It is based, as I said, on whatever clinical and lab manifestations patient shows, and has to be monitored on a patient-to-patient basis. So we use it a lot, but we use it in select situations. To simplify these select situations is persistent fever, shortness of breath, as I said, second spike of fever, inability to wean, RT-PCR negative or not readily available at that moment when you want to do an emergent decision, high risk patients. These are the classical situations you would use them. CT score does not always match with clinical picture, and respiratory co-pathogens have become a big challenge for a diagnostician now to take a call on these CT images. So ultrasound has a niche indication in COVID ICUs and wards. Thank you very much. And let's not ask when these masks will come out. Let's just keep them on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ashu, for a very comprehensive coverage on the role of radiology, pulmonary radiology as far as COVID-19 is concerned, and highlighting a lot of very, very important points. I'll just make a few points before I ask Dr. Raju Sharma to give his comments. I think what you rightly highlighted was that many patients may have no symptoms or may have, but may have a CT which may show some patches. This has been well documented, and that's why it's important to look at the entire clinical picture and not just the CT to decide on the treatment strategy. Second is that if you have an RT-PCR negative patient and you are strongly suspecting COVID-19, getting a CT would be useful in making a diagnosis. But you should also continue to try and get a definite diagnosis from the point of view of RT-PCR. Now we have the rapid antigen test, which can give you a result in around 5 to 10 minutes. And when you have a positivity rate which is high, more than 10 to 20%, which is happening in many parts of the country, your rapid antigen test tends to do very well. We had actually stopped doing the rapid antigen test when the first wave had come down because the positivity rate was very low. But now in the emergency, we're finding that almost 70% of patients we can pick up by just doing the rapid antigen test, and that decreases the load as far as your RT-PCR is concerned. Also, one could use a CBNAT, which is also useful because it gives you a result in about 1.5 hours to 2 hours. But if your tests are all negative and you have a strong suspicion, a CT will be very helpful. It's useful when you are actually going on to the second week in moderate disease. You're now wondering what is happening. Patient saturation is falling and you want to really get a better idea. In the ICU setting, I think you will predominantly rely on a chest X-ray and your ultrasound, which would be more useful as point of care test. And that is something that we need to keep in mind. Now with patients being put on steroids very early, high dose steroids being used, tocilizumab being used, we are getting a major concern as far as opportunistic infection is concerned. And that causes a big issue among us as clinicians as to what to do. Today morning only, I was discussing one case with Dr. Anjan, who had taken high-dose steroids. He had taken baricitinib also outside. He was improving, and suddenly now his X-ray done yesterday night shows a patch on the left side. And the issue was, could this be fungal infection? Could this be a secondary bacterial infection? Should we now add colistin, or should we consider adding antifungal? So those become big problems, and sometimes you need to have some sort of radiology to help you. But it's not also possible because you have a person who is on a very high flow nasal cannula, and shifting him for a CT scan is not possible also. So that's why you have to really look at your X-ray closely, and sometimes look at the X-ray and try and make a judgment call on what should you do. Sometimes you may have a low threshold of giving both a good gram-positive, gram-negative cover and an antifungal cover if the patient is deteriorating. So you have to look at the clinical picture. Also, as Dr. Ashu rightly mentioned, the whole issue of post-COVID lung fibrosis, I think the term is wrong, because many patients whom we sort of call as having lung fibrosis, those fibrotic images disappear by the 12th week. The so-called bronchiectasis, bronchialectasis also goes away. And now this is being well documented in the literature. And therefore, causing fibrosis is probably not a right term to use. I think that is something important for us to keep in mind. So I'd ask Dr. Raju Sharma to give his comments. Then after that, Neeraj can give his comments from the clinical point of view, and then we can have comments from the people on the panel.
Thank you, sir. I think since Ashu has discussed the thoracic manifestations in detail, let me broaden the scope and take it beyond the thorax and talk a little bit about the role of radiology in the extrathoracic manifestations of COVID. And the first thing that comes to mind is the CNS, because of the vascular coagulopathy that this disease causes. We have seen patients manifesting with stroke, and a non-contrast CT of the head is a very useful tool whenever clinically you suspect that there is the likelihood of a stroke. We've seen all kinds of strokes, both large infarcts, hemorrhagic infarcts, as well as small lacunar infarcts in the setting of COVID-19. We have also occasionally picked up white matter lesions, which are essentially manifestations of viral encephalitis. So that is also a known manifestation. The second area where radiology can play a useful role is in the abdominal manifestations of COVID. And again, because of the vascular coagulopathy, these patients can present with bowel ischemia. They can have thrombosis both on the arterial side as well as on the venous side. We've seen patients with thrombosis in the superior mesenteric vein manifesting with bowel wall thickening, lack of enhancement in the gut, as well as advanced cases of perforation of the gut because of ischemia to the bowel. It also causes problems in the liver and pancreas, which unfortunately do not manifest much on imaging. These patients frequently have altered liver function tests, but that's more of a cellular issue, and the damage is at a cellular level, which is not picked up frequently on imaging. We have seen patients manifesting with biliary stasis in the context of COVID-19, so that's another thing to remember. So essentially, if the patient has severe abdominal pain, you need to be thinking, does he need a CT angiogram with a photogram coupled along with it to pick up thrombosis in the mesenteric circulation and the sequelae of that thrombosis in the gut in terms of bowel ischemia. People have also documented cardiac abnormalities on imaging, essentially ranging from myocarditis to cardiomyopathy, and that can be picked up only on MR, but that's something that is not really electively required in the acute setting, at least for the purpose of management. But very often we land up doing non-contra CTs of the head in these patients whenever a stroke is suspected clinically, and often we have done abdominal CTs to look for cause of pain abdomen. The ACE2 receptors are present in abundance in the gut, in the stomach, in the bowel. So you can also get viral gastritis, viral enteritis, as well as viral colitis in these patients. So it's not unusual to see thickened bowel on CTs done in these patients to look for pain abdomen. The other comment that I would like to make is that in addition to what Ashu stressed on when you should do a CT, I think we need to stress a lot on when you should not do a CT. And CT should not be used as a screening tool. It should not be used as an alternative to RT-PCR. All attempts, as Dr. Guleria pointed out, should be made to get an RT-PCR diagnosis of COVID-19. And imaging in that context, CT should be used only when your clinical decision is going to change and RT-PCR is not available to you, or the result will be delayed by 48 hours or so. Then in those isolated cases, you may go on to use CT. But it's very important to remember that though CT is a versatile tool, it has to be used in a judicious manner, in consultation with your clinicians, and also in consultation with the clinical picture of the patient. We need to be looking at the patient as a whole and not be treating images. Thank you.
Thank you. Neeraj, your comments?
Yes, sir. I just want to re-stress what Professor Raju just said. We have to see the patient in totality, not just on imaging basis. And the very concept of getting multiple CTs at different time interval has no role whatsoever in management of patient, and that should be very clear to everyone. And just because you are getting at frequent CT at frequent interval does not guarantee that you are going to survive this disease. That should also be clear. And this feeling among patients that if they get this frequent imaging done even after recovery will hasten their post-COVID recovery is again something which needs to be re-emphasized, that it's not going to affect their overall outcome or the management strategy as far as post-COVID fibrosis, which again is a misnomer, as Sir rightly pointed out, because it anyhow is going to recover on its own. There's nothing we can do about that. And CT has its inherent problem. It's not safe as it is being pointed out in most places. There is always a set of population which is vulnerable to basically sort of mutation because of even a very limited insult in form of radiology or whatever. What we call as two-hit theory for any mutation leading to malignancy. So if we are doing a CT scan on such a mass level multiple times, then we might be creating a problem where we might actually land up with more chances of patient developing malignancy out of this. And this should not be ignored because this COVID-19 is not going to go away. And if we are not careful, if we misuse all these potential useful tool in a wrong way, then we might be harming ourselves and people around us. So we have to be very judicious, and CT, to best of our understanding, after treating COVID for almost 1 year, has a very limited role in a very select group of patients. It's not required for everyone. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Any comments from anyone on the panel before I ask Rajiv to take up the questions?
I just wanted to put in a point, sir, regarding patient counseling in this context. Because many times what happens when these patients come to us and a diagnosis of COVID is given to them, there is panic, they are really worried. And because of that panic, even if you tell them that CT is not going to change the management, they go for a CT scan just to know whether the lungs are involved or not. So there is a great role of counseling and speaking to the patient at the time of diagnosis and telling them that even if there is lung involvement, it is not going to change the management. What changes the management, it has to be explained to them, is their saturation. So rather than doing serial CTs, if they just monitor their saturation at home, that is something which is going to help them more, rather than doing serial CTs and they keep WhatsApping you the CT severity score. They'll get it done at day 5. Even if you tell them that's not going to make a difference, they'll do another one at day 10 and say my CT severity has increased from 7 to 15. What should I do, doctor? So I think a proper communication has to be established with the patient. And rather than sending the CT severity scores, they should be sending the oxygen saturations to you, especially during the second week. So spending some time at diagnosis would go a long way in monitoring these patients.
I think that's a very, very important point, not only for the CT scan, but even for the biomarkers. You have patients who will say, my CRP has gone up a little bit, it's going up. Now, should I start steroids? Or my D dimer is high and I'm now starting anticoagulants. So all of that, I think, is important to explain to the patient that these are inflammatory markers. They will go up in any infection, and you should look at the clinical profile and then only take a call on what treatment to give. But there is usually a panic reaction, and that is why we need to really try and talk to the patient. So that is a very, very important point.
So there's nobody on the panel who would like to put up a comment. We actually don't have too many questions today, which is surprising. It means Ashu's made things very clear to people that there's actually virtually no question. There is one, so let's begin with that one that says, what is the equivalent CT severity score of 15 by 25 in terms of the 40-point score in terms of bronchopulmonary segment? So maybe Ashu could address that.
Yeah. So Rajiv, since I have time and lesser questions, let me not answer in simple terms and let me expand this story a little to say that what causes a patient results a patient's survival or a poor outcome. Yeah. Now, one is CT severity score in moderate disease, that it is this much, but eventually we want patients to survive. And the question we are all looking to answer is, which are the patients we are losing and why? So we are drawing on all our experience from MERS and ARDS. And now this whole concept is of how much of the lung is non-aerated and how much of the lung is well aerated. And a lot of people have taken, automatic quantitative methods to predict one. So some will say that it's the well aerated lung which is going to determine survival. And obviously, how much non-aerated lung is there, that will mean worse outcome. And then there is a zone in between, which is a recruitable lung. Whenever those who are in critical care know, whenever we talk about an ARDS lung, we talk about recruitability, which means alveolar recruitability. It looks like a consolidation, but it is expandable. And then there is lung, which looks like a consolidation, but is not expandable. So there is a good ground glass, good consolidation, and bad ground glass, bad consolidation. So that is the whole concept. So now to say what will translate into what, one would obviously have to see it on the scan, but broadly, if you see 15 by 25 means if you take in multiples, that 3/5 of your lung is gone. So in a 40 score, this should come to around 27, 28. Although in an index patient, it may differ, because that is talking of segments, lobes. So how many segments in that particular lobe? But broadly, it means that, 3 by 5 of your lung. And in a score of 40, it would come to about 27, 28.
Right. So I don't see more questions here, but let me ask you one from a perspective of a patient. Apart from the benefit of going to get a CT, can you actually get COVID while you're getting a CT done? can that actually be a risk factor to getting COVID if you actually don't have COVID?
It's very much dependent on the kind of volumes that diagnostic center is handling, and the amount of anti-infection sanitization procedures. If you remember that when the COVID-19 came, even we used to take a turnaround time of 4 hours, between two patients. By the time we would sanitize the whole unit, and now in a scan setup like ours also, that time is like down to 20 minutes. So if it depends on how throughput of the center and how much you have separated it. Now, suppose you do 100 patients in a day, and then obviously, the kind of sanitization or the kind of ventilation that you will be able to ensure is going to get compromised. So in any situation in the first week, leave alone your going also increases the risk of your transmitting to patients. So why do you want to get up on day 3 and 4 with the running nose, sneezing, coughing, and go into a situation that we can spread it to other places? So obviously CT scan rooms, even our CT scan room, unless you have very scientific negative AHUs being done, is a place which is difficult to ventilate. So, when avoidable, especially if a place has very large volumes and several people waiting in waiting areas, then it becomes a crowded place. For the very reason that we close OPDs, like wherever we have crowding, there is a chance of transmission because physical distancing becomes challenging to implement.
Rajiv, can I make a point?
Of course, sir.
I think if we go back to reducing the number of unnecessary CTs, we would also reduce that risk of being super spreader. The CT room will be less of a super spreader if we stop doing unnecessary CTs on patients' demand. Patients read on social media and they want a CT done for that reason because they want reassurance. That's something to be discouraged very strongly. And if we use CT in a judicious manner, we'll cut down on the numbers and it'll be easier to follow those meticulous sanitization protocols that we all want.
Right, sir.
I think it's an important issue, if I may just add, because of the fact that many centers, because of the high numbers that they have, don't really have that much of a protocol in place in terms of sanitization and looking at the aerosol that is generated in the CT room, which may at times be an issue. This has also been an issue that has been raised in people who come for vaccination. A large number of people get crowded in an area and there's a huge demand for vaccination. And the issue that some of them get symptomatic after getting the vaccine after a few days, and they wonder whether they've got COVID because of the vaccine or it happened because they visited a place where COVID appropriate behavior was not maintained. So I think that is something that we need to keep in mind, because whenever you have large volumes, the sanitization and other things really actually tend to be compromised.
Right, sir. So we do have a couple of questions that have now come up. So the next one is that there's a patient who's recovered on home isolation. Do we need to do a CT to prognosticate him?
Ashu, what is your comments?
No, sir, we don't. Currently also we are not going. I'll tell you how we started in the post-COVID clinic also. We started calling up all patients who had been discharged from Jhajjar or trauma center, and we had details of, and asking them what level of residual respiratory symptoms they had, and we asked them to come into the OPD. Then based on their MMRC score or shortness of breath, we chose to go in for a chest radiograph and PFT. And only if that was compromised, we did a CT. But on the other hand, suppose we are discharging a patient on home oxygen, on LTOT, we are discharging the patient on low-dose steroids, and we may have initiated antifibrotics also. Then before discharge, we may want to have CT scan, because when we see that patient, 6 weeks later or 12 weeks later, we would not know that how much of it has reversed. So patients who are being discharged, on LTOT, patients who are being discharged on antifibrotics, it may be prudent to have a baseline CT at discharge. Means it's not the baseline, it's the last one which can serve then as baseline to you, to see whether the antifibrotics have worked or not. But those whom you are discharging without any oxygen support, there is no justification as of now to do an endpoint CT.
Okay.
Ashu, if I recall correctly, Rajiv's question was for home isolation. If a person has recovered completely on home isolation, I think the answer is no. No CT at all.
No.
No symptoms come.
This is
no
only for
oxygen
those with
requirement, has
residual.
recovered.
So let me put it two ways. One is the patient has recovered totally in home isolation. No need for any CT scan. I would say no need for any blood test also, if you want my opinion. Just ask him to be healthy and don't get into too many WhatsApp messages and start getting his biomarkers done. But what about patients who are discharged? What is our policy, Neeraj, in terms of asking patients to get a CT scan in patients whom we're discharging?
So even if a patient is discharged on oxygen, we usually do not ask them to get a CT done. We ask them to follow up after a certain time, and if required, we will take a call whether this patient is going to benefit from repeat CT. Because after all, our treatment strategy, unless there is a possibility of infection, super infection after that, is not going to change. That is continue with oxygen and chest physiotherapy. So we usually don't recommend any follow-up CT after we discharge, irrespective of how severe the condition had been, unless indicated for some other reason during follow-up.
Okay, so I think it depends on how your patient is behaving. And by and large, if you have a person whom you feel is stable, it may be worthwhile to wait. Sometimes patients will improve, and a lot of patients that we've seen have gone home and within a few weeks are off oxygen, maintaining saturation of 94, 95, and have done very well. This is a disease where the healing process takes sometimes a few weeks rather than just days. And therefore, I think one has to be very cautious, both in terms of how frequently to get the scan done. And in my mind, I mean, this is something that I've had a debate with a lot of pulmonologists, is to start antifibrotics. I think this is a post-infectious disease where what we call as fibrosis is actually not fibrosis. And I would actually wait for about 3 months at least before I would say that this patient has actually fibrosis and may benefit from antifibrotics. But there is a counter argument to that also. I'm just giving you what my opinion is, because very often these patients whom you would feel are having fibrosis, it totally disappears. The shadow which look like fibrotic, the bronchiectasis, the bronchiectasis, all of it seems to just vanish with time. So I think it's important to remember that pulmonary rehabilitation is probably the most important part as far as recovery is concerned. You could give a low dose steroids for a little longer time because that may help in the decreasing the inflammation. But that is what my opinion is. Maybe the others in the group can add on to that.
So there's a follow-up question on that point, sir, that if it's not fibrosis, what should we call it?
That's a very interesting question, because a lot of radiologists
Post-COVID lung changes.
Lung sequelae.
As of now, Rajiv, post-COVID lung changes at the moment. You can even use the word sequelae, but because it has a potential for reversal, so post-COVID lung changes. I have one more submission, which, every clinician has all right to demand, is that every patient who undergoes a CT scan anywhere should have access to that CT scan. And actually, even, in our setups, we have to figure out how we give films to patients usually. And because what is happening is that in between the two waves, we faced a lot of second admissions. It's not that we had second admissions because of respiratory co-infections or because of, shortness of breath. And it was very difficult because we did not access to the previous imaging. And, the post-COVID changes in some patients look like NSIP, which in CTD patients, we had no idea that is it CTD related or was it a consequence of COVID? So my submission is that whichever of your patients undergo CT scans anywhere, please insist that they maintain soft copies and obtain CDs of all this imaging, because it will be required.
Dr. Marwal?
I just wanted to ask you, madam, how was your experience regarding the rapid onset pulmonary fibrosis? Because many a times we see that after 2 weeks of COVID, these patients, they develop good going honeycombing on the CT scans. And these are the people who are elderly, male smokers, who are the high risk group for as such to develop IPF with comorbidities, diabetes, hypertension. So in that case, sir, as our experience has been in such patients who develop within 2 weeks, 3 weeks, good going pulmonary fibrosis with honeycombing, that probably they are the ones who got the predisposing factors, and probably it is COVID which has triggered the fibrosis and IPF kind of a thing. But as we know, IPF can be triggered by viral infections, and probably COVID also might be contributing to it. So these patients do progress, and our fear was that they might have flares, because if you don't treat them with antifibrotic, as we are all aware, antifibrotic do have anti-inflammatory potential as well. So if you let them go, instead of improving with all the risk factors for IPF, they may have a flare, come back again. And few of the patients do come back to us as well with a persistent inflammation or a progressive inflammation and fibrosis even after discharge whilst they are on oxygen. So what has been your experience, and what would be your guidance regarding such patients?
Yeah, so I'm going to say my part, and then I'm going to let Guleria sir come in. See, when sir said that when to start antifibrotics is a very big controversy, because studies which are based on radiopath, which means they are basically studies which are postmortem studies, have shown that DAD means if you have a diffuse alveolar damage pattern, which means in patients with severe disease who have a DAD pattern, the fibrosis comes early. There is no doubt about it. On histopathology, there has been demonstration of honeycombing changes even in the late second week and third week of illness. So when we were going in between, there was a school of thought where there was a lot of publications which said, is that the time to start the antifibrotics? So I was going to ask Guleria sir the same thing, that in between there was a school of thought which said third week, and then we are saying third month. There is undoubtedly this phenotype which you are mentioning for, and this is what I told you, that when we interpret the scans and when we help the clinician take a decision on stepping up of the immune suppression and tailoring the immune suppression, we try to take this reversibility call. And once the honeycombing sets in, there is no doubt that that part of the lung is not going to reverse. But what I said, that in this phenotype, the number of survivors are also fewer, is what you must have experienced also. These are the people we find very difficult to pull out only. So definitely severe DAD means diffuse alveolar damage, which is the histological correlate of ARDS in the severe form, is associated with early fibrosis in a phenotype of patient. And in these patients, the number of survivors only are few. Whether to use antifibrotics or not, what is the current school of thought, sir will have to answer. But there was literature in between which said maybe third week is the time, or late second week, where you should be already starting the antifibrotics. Sir, you want to answer?
Yeah, so I'd like to just add, there are 2 points. One is, you're very right, there is a phenotype which is being said that you may have honeycombing occurring early. But this is also those patients who really don't come out that well because they have extensive lung damage and land up on being on a ventilator for a very, very long period of time. And often they're actually on ECMO, and you're talking of lung transplant and things like that in them. The other issue is, yes, in them, the argument was that if you start antifibrotics early, because antifibrotics take some time to act also. It's not that this, so you're able to then get that action started much more earlier. What I was referring to was basically patients who are being discharged now, and therefore they don't have that much of honeycombing, because those who really have that honeycombing, majority of them don't really come out or tend to be on ventilatory support or for a very, very long period of time. The second issue is the issue of are you at times incidentally picking up honeycombing in the older age group, because many of them may have features of IPF but are never, or have honeycombing on the X-ray, and which has incidentally picked up. Even in the pre-COVID era, we would have patients who would get a CT scan done for some other reason, and they would have features of honeycombing which was picked up, and it was said that could this be age related or is it IPF, and should we start antifibrotics or not? I remember one very senior army officer here. His father had he was posted to Hyderabad. His father had gone there, developed a pneumonia. For the pneumonia, CT was done, which showed honeycombing. He came back to Delhi. He had his lung function was almost normal. His saturation was maintained, and he just followed up and said, "Why should I take any drugs when I'm feeling all right?" And he continued like that till the COVID started. I haven't seen him before after that, but he was doing very well with maintaining his lung function. So you have some people who may have honeycombing being picked up incidentally when you're doing so many scans. So you may have one group in the elderly who have incidentally been diagnosed to have mild IPF over and above COVID, and the other who may be a phenotype who have a very bad course and lying up in going into that category where you're talking of ECMO and lung transplant and things like that. Anyone else would like to add on to their experience? I think it would be worthwhile to really get some idea.
I'm Dr. Mahapatra. Sir, if some patients were forced to start antifibrotic because that at the end of 1 month they become dyspneic, they are unable to even if walk. In those cases, we do not have option without starting. Even if I believe that starting antifibrotic early stages has a better role than is established fibrosis. Some cases selectively, I don't have an option other than starting at least benefit of doubt. And this patient has improved dramatically. I have seen, we do not have RCT, but it's my personal experience, many patients has improved. And selectively we have given, we are very rational in giving it.
So again, there is no evidence, and my argument would be that if the person is improved very dramatically, unlikely to be because of antifibrotics. Because antifibrotics will take a much longer action, even in your fibrotic ILDs, whether it be IPF or fibrotic and NSIP. It takes a longer time for it to improve.
Yes,
they'll probably improve, like I said, your CT scan in many of them will improve on its own. My own feeling is, and again, I'm sort of, this is just my own feeling, that these are patients who respond on their own because this is an inflammatory response. This is not an immune-mediated fibrosis. This is a post-infective related inflammatory response in the lung, which is different from what we see in the fibrosis that we see in IPF. And therefore, it should respond more to steroids to begin with and to pulmonary rehabilitation. But in cases that you find that there is honeycombing or who continue to have fibrosis after, you could say, 8 to 12 weeks, you could consider antifibrotics in them. And of course, there are a large number of trials which have now started. If you go to the clinical trial gov, you will find number of trials have started now on antifibrotics. So we will get probably some data by the end of the year. Any comments from anyone else?
None of the cases we have continued beyond 3 months. After 3 months, we have stopped wherever we have used.
Okay, Neeraj, your comments on any of these points, including the...
Two of the VIPs who were admitted with us had score of somewhere around 21/25, and they got their CT done after 3 months of discharge, and it's hardly 4/25 without any antifibrotic. In fact, steroid was given for almost 4 weeks, and apart from that, nothing else was done. So most probably all this COVID-related fibrosis-like changes in lung will basically heal on its own given time. And like I said, like you have already discussed, that the role of antifibrotic will come if it is a progressive fibrosis. Once it is a fibrosis, it's anyway not going to affect that aspect. So it's not a progressive change, and it will improve with time. And I think time is the biggest healer in COVID-19, and that should be something which everybody should understand.
I had a question for Dr. Bhalla. So this is regarding the CT severity scores. I really appreciate your point regarding the age and the comorbidities in the different kind of manifestations with different patients with the same score have. So do you think that there is a limitation in terms of the 6 score, that it just tells you about the percentage of involvement and not the density of the involvement? So somebody may have a more than 50% involvement, which is a minimal kind of GGO which is there, whereas somebody else who's got more than 50% involvement with dense consolidation. So probably the difference in the symptom and the manifestations is because of the depth and the density of the involvement, ma'am. What do you have to, regarding with your experience?
Yeah, so the morphology is very critical. There is something known as, again, out of ARDS experience, modified Wales score. There are some centers such as CMC Vellore, which adds people will add 1 point for GGO, but 2.2 consolidation. Why we advocate so since, we were getting a query now every day on this, that after we give the CT score for the last couple of days, I'm flooded in the morning with quantification of relative amount of GGO consolidation, crazy paving, because as I said, everybody wants to know reversibility at the end of the day. So we have sort of, worked out a system ourselves today. And hopefully from tomorrow, we will start reflecting that how much percentage of the abnormality is GGO. We try to, at the moment, we are trying to divide it into at least 4 or 5 patterns. We will tell whether it's GGO, consolidation, crazy paving, organizing pneumonia, or reticular opacities with bronchial dilatation. And let us see how much. So we don't intend to touch the 15 score or the 40 score because we felt that it will create a lot of confusion in the mind of the treating physician. But we will reflect the morphology separately as a percentage of the abnormality. The morphology is critical. And even the ground glass, I want to bring out, even in the ground glass, there are 2 types. One is the one which we saw, multifocal, peripheral, which will reverse. But if it's a ground glass which looks like AIP, acute interstitial pneumonia, or acute exacerbation IPF, wherein your whole lung gets filled up and the shrinkage of lung volumes come early, I've seen that is another phenotype which a complete lung function recovery is not happening and have poorer outcomes. So ground glass, as you know, can reflect so many things. It doesn't always reflect acute inflammation. It's just a partial volume averaging of so many things. And many patients have a diffuse AIP type pattern, the classical Havenrick called earlier, who also show a poor recovery. So morphology is very critical in judging the prognosis. And as I said, when we have to take a call, whether patient should be labeled for ECMO lung transplant, one will be duration, second will definitely be morphology, whether we think that this morphology is likely to reverse or not.
We do have a few questions now, so maybe we could spend the next 5 minutes just addressing those questions specifically. The first one is, should subsegmental pulmonary embolism be treated with therapeutic dose of anticoagulation? If you pick up something on a CT, would that be an indication for therapeutic anticoagulation?
So Neeraj, what is your comment on this? You're muted.
Neeraj is still mute.
So if a patient is not maintaining saturation, the oxygen requirement is increasing, and there is a possibility that this embolus is just an initial finding and it has potential to expand. Then definitely these patients will require some sort of intervention in conjunction with intervention radiologist or the cardiologist, whatever option is available, or at least therapeutic anticoagulation may be tried after ruling out any evidence of bleed from any side.
So I think this is something that we need to keep in mind because sometimes, although now, as Ashu said, the threshold for giving anticoagulants has become very low, and many patients are on prophylactic or semi-therapeutic doses of anticoagulants when they are in the ICU. And chances, what we were seeing in the past in terms of pulmonary embolism has become less. But still, it's worthwhile to keep in mind, because if you have a patient who has persistent hypoxemia and is not improving, then it's something that you need to keep in mind. I know some centers, and there was one series I think published from one area in India, where they even tried in patients who had persistent hypoxemia and the X-ray or the CT did not really could not explain this. They even tried low dose thrombolytic therapy as a part of treatment strategies, saying that this may help in improving the VQ mismatch and improve perfusion because of clotting happening as a part of the disease process itself. So I'm just going to, I don't think there's enough data, but they did give a TPA also low dose and published a series saying that it was helpful to some extent. I'm just going to ask Dr. Raju Sharma what his sort of comments are on thromboembolic phenomena in other parts, extrapulmonary, and whether that should be looked at aggressively, say in the ICU by doing routine ultrasound or something else.
I wouldn't think routine ultrasound, sir, but if a patient complains of pain abdomen, then at least the main trunk of the SMA and the SMV can be evaluated on the bedside only by doing a good Doppler. And if there is any further suspicion, then if the patient's condition allows, then one would definitely want to plan a CT angiography.
Yeah, because I think it's important to have a high index of suspicion. I remember one patient had pain abdomen and then there was a fall in hemoglobin, and he had a a bleed inside, which was initially missed because it was felt that this could be sort of gastritis only, and but it was basically intra-abdominal bleed that the person was having.
Right, sir. Now Dr. Marva, can we just make it a short comment?
If I may add, sir, in addition to the clot burden, it is also important to look at the comorbidities and the underlying cardiopulmonary status of the patient. If you have a patient whose ejection fraction is at 25-30%, congestive heart failure, he has a segmental thromboembolism, we would definitely treat them with therapeutic anticoagulation because they don't have any reserve. Similarly, anybody with emphysema with chronic respiratory failure developing a segmental pulmonary embolism should get therapeutic anticoagulation. There is somebody who was healthy, doesn't have any fibrosis, has a small clot burden, probably he might not require therapeutic anticoagulation. And that is our experience from the pre-COVID era.
Right. Now, the next question, I think, is specifically to the radiologist. How do you differentiate a hypoperfused from a hyperinflated lung segment?
In general, in life, I assume, or in terms of COVID.
I'm assuming it's a general query.
Yeah. So you want to know basically that whether a lung is looking dark, is it because there's too much air inside it, or the vessels going there are closed? So in the most basic of terms, what you need to do is an expiratory scan on the table. Even in context of COVID, if we are taking a scan and we find an area which is unusually looking darker than the next rest of the lung, we need to take a expiratory scan, and that is the basis on which then we see the nature of the vessels inside it. We see whether on expiration the area becomes more prominent or becomes proportionally prominent to the rest of the lung. If it becomes more prominent, it implies that it's air trapping. Having said that, in context of COVID-19 pneumonia and microthrombi, there has been a lot of literature on DCT angiography. So if you actually have a situation where you have a patient whose saturation drop is not explained by any thing in the lung, we can do a angiography. We do actually all our CTPAs on dual energy because our scanner is a dual energy scanner, and we are able to reconstruct perfusion images, which are, so the lung window serves like the ventilation map, and we generate the perfusion map, and we are able to map out the areas of VQ mismatch. So in terms of advances, it is the DCT angiography, and in terms of the most basic concept is at least the expiratory scan.
Okay, and the other question on the performance of the CT is, how are you currently sanitizing your CT scans after performing a CT? What protocol is being followed?
Sir, you want to answer or should I take it?
So in the initial days, Rajiv, we were using sodium hypochlorite for the floor, and there was a very rigorous process of doing it with 2 buckets, and all the surfaces in the room were sanitized using sodium hypochlorite. We have later on added on UV lights. We put UV lights in our CT room, and that acts as a very good and robust method of sanitization because you don't need to fumigate the room. The vendors don't want the room to be fumigated because that causes damage to the equipment. The CT scanner is a sensitive piece of equipment, and fumigation causes damage to that. So we leave the UV lights on for just a period of about 15 to 20 minutes, close the room. Everyone has to step out from the room, of course. And once that period is over, you can switch off the UV lights and you are ready to go.
Right. Now, the next question again is on doing a few CT scans. We have just one more question before I take up the final one. At what point of time should you consider doing a CT for detecting fibrosis in a post-COVID fibrosis? What are the markers which would tell you that this patient needs a CT to detect fibrosis?
Neeraj, do you want to answer that?
I said, although I'm going to I think because they are going, I repeated that we were doing an MMRC score, a 6-minute walk test, PFT, chest radiograph, and taking a decision on that.
I think Neeraj's answer is going to be he doesn't want it done anyway.
Yes, sir, because after
no,
all.
But I'll tell you, sir, roughly.
So if I may just
but Neeraj, we recruited about 200 patients. we roughly recruited about 200 patients. And to give you an estimate, we needed to do about 18 CT scans so far. That was the proportion of the 200 we called in. We did do about 18 CT scans, of which also 6, 7 turned out to be done, had like very minimal fibrosis, and 10 to 12 had fibrosis or whatever post-COVID sequelae of any significance.
I think
With PFT impairment. We didn't do it on anybody who didn't have PFT impairment.
So I think if you have a person who is having impairment on lung function, maybe at around 12 weeks, a fall in the saturation doing a 6-minute walk test or other parameters which tell you that there may be some degree of compromise in his lung, then it's worthwhile to consider it at that point in time. But doing it too early probably is of no use, because you have to give time for the illness to heal. And as Neeraj said, time is the best factor. So give it some time. Majority of your patients, you will not need to do anything, and they will start maintaining a good saturation of 96, 97, and lung function will show a very minimal restricted effect, which would be acceptable. Neeraj, any comment from your side?
Again, the same thing, sir, because pulmonary rehabilitation is going to be the mainstay of therapeutic option for such patients. So getting it done too early, unless we are suspecting something else along with that, it's not required unless the clinician feels so.
Right. Thank you, Neeraj. So we've reached the end of our 90 minutes. And if you'd like to now summarize and close, I don't even have any significant questions left on the panel.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, let me thank Dr. Ashu Said Bhalla for an excellent talk. I think she really covered it very well and was able to explain things in a very comprehensive manner. Also, Dr. Raju Sharma for bringing in the extra pulmonary concepts and also explaining many other factors. And of course, Dr. Neeraj Nischal for the clinical point of view. I think it's very important for us to understand how to put CT scan and radiology, chest X-ray in proper perspective, especially when we start looking at doing these or sort of advising these investigations, not at a tertiary care center, but at a tier 2, tier 3 city or in the rural India, because there you will have more issues of getting all of these done. And then if you say that I can't really manage COVID without having a CT, would not be a right thing to say. So we will have to develop strategies that if we say that COVID is now going to spread to rural India and we need to have doctors out there managing it, I think you will have to take more and more sort of focus on the chest X-ray, which is easily available, and work on how you can use a chest X-ray in the best manner possible. And only a limited number of people really see that they should get a CT done in such a setting, because it's easier to get it done, let's say in a tier 3, in a city like Delhi or Mumbai. But if you're going to a smaller town, you will not have that many CT scan machines available, and the clinician will have to rely only on the chest X-ray. And therefore, that becomes very, very important for us to understand the patterns, which was what Ashu showed in the beginning. I think that is something that all the mentoring institutes should keep in mind when you start your training program for doctors in primary health centers and in other areas. So we can discuss CT scan, but the focus, I think, should be on the chest X-ray predominantly. So thank you very much. And I'm really grateful to all of you for having come on to this webinar. Today, we could not have the representatives from the Health Ministry on board because of a meeting, but they are following it up aggressively to see that we are able to roll this out throughout the country in terms of the centers of excellence and their subsequent program in various parts of the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everyone. And we'll be back again tomorrow. We're talking about investigations, so both microbiology investigations and blood investigations. And Dr. Manish Maneja will be presenting that. So 3 p.m. again tomorrow. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.